Something happened behind palace walls that was never supposed to become public. A number was written on a piece of paper, and that number was so explosive, so personal, so financially devastating that when it finally crossed the Atlantic, it didn't just land on a desk in California, it landed like a detonation inside Prince Harry's life. Because this was not a warning, this was not a discussion, this was a bill, and not just any bill. £59 million. A number so large it didn't just ask for money, it demanded consequences. In the final week of February, while the world was busy with its usual headlines and distractions, a quiet financial document left Buckingham Palace. No press announcement, no public statement, just a sealed envelope moving through official channels, carrying a figure that had been quietly growing for years. Inside the palace, this wasn't sudden. This had been building for a long time, quietly, patiently, almost like the palace had been keeping score. Behind those historic stone walls and administrative offices the public never sees, advisors had been tracking numbers for years. Not small numbers, not routine expenses. These were the hidden costs of a royal exit, the kind of costs that don't appear in interviews, documentaries, or public statements about financial independence. Property renovations, security transitions, legal consultations, staff restructuring, infrastructure changes, administrative reorganizations, each one small on its own. But together they became a mountain. And that mountain had a name written on the file: Prince Harry. When Harry and Meghan stepped away from royal duties in 2020, the public was told it would be a clean break. Independence, freedom, a new life. But inside the palace, nothing is ever simple. The Monarchy is not just a family, it's a machine. A massive, complex institution built on systems, properties, security networks, staff structures, and legal frameworks that have existed for generations. You don't just walk away from something like that without leaving financial footprints behind. At first, palace officials tried to handle everything quietly. They absorbed some cost, reassigned others, delayed decisions on the rest. There was still hope at that time that things would calm down, that relationships would stabilize, that maybe some informal understanding would eventually settle the matter. But years passed, and instead of shrinking, the numbers grew. One of the biggest issues was Frogmore Cottage. The renovation alone was already controversial, but what the public never really understood was that Frogmore wasn't just a house renovation. The entire surrounding infrastructure had been upgraded. Security systems, staffing arrangements, logistics networks, protection planning. When Harry and Meghan left, that entire system had to be reorganized again. And reorganizing royal infrastructure is not cheap, not even close. Then came security. This was where the numbers really started climbing, because protecting a prince, even one who steps away from royal duties, is not something governments and institutions take lightly. Threat assessments, international coordination, protection teams, secure transport planning, relocation logistics from the UK to Canada, then Canada to California. Every move required planning, manpower, and money. A lot of money. Then legal issues entered the picture. Lawsuits, media battles, security disputes, administrative consultations, institutional reviews. Even when Harry pursued legal fights privately, palace advisors and royal legal infrastructure often still had to be consulted behind the scenes. Every consultation meant more hours, more staff, more cost. For a while, the palace covered it quietly using contingency funds, the kind of funds royal households keep for emergencies and unusual situations. But this situation wasn't ending. It was continuing, year after year, expense after expense, until eventually palace accountants started doing something very serious. They started adding everything together. By late 2024, financial advisors inside Buckingham Palace had compiled a full internal review. Every outstanding cost, every unresolved expense, every administrative impact tied to the Sussex departure. The total kept rising as they reviewed more files, more departments, more years, until finally the number was printed clearly on a summary page: 59 million. And once a number like that is written down in black and white inside a palace accounting office, it stops being a discussion and starts becoming a decision. The file was taken to King Charles. This is where the story becomes less about money and more about something else entirely. Because Charles was not just reviewing a financial report, he was looking at a document connected to his son, his own son, but he was also the king. And the crown does not run on informal arrangements forever. At some point, every unresolved issue becomes a matter of institutional responsibility. Charles asked questions, detailed questions. Which costs were already paid? Which were disputed? Which were institutional? Which were personal? Could any of it be shared responsibility? Advisors answered carefully. They had reviewed this for months. Legal teams had checked the numbers. Treasury specialists had verified the calculations. The conclusion was clear. The costs were real, they were documented, and they were tied to the Sussex transition. And then came the moment that changed everything. The king approved the invoice. Not a conversation, not a negotiation, an invoice. A formal financial document prepared by palace financial offices listing categories of expenses and ending with a final total $59 million. Once prepared, the document was sealed and sent through official channels. Within hours, it was on its way to California. And here is where the story takes a turn that makes this entire situation even more explosive. Because while Buckingham Palace was calculating costs and preparing invoices, something else was happening thousands of miles away. Something much quieter, much more subtle, but possibly far more strategic. Meghan was moving money, not in one dramatic sale, not in one big announcement, but through a series of quiet financial restructurings that most people never noticed. Business holdings were reorganized. Partnerships were shifted into new entities. Some investments were quietly sold. Others were moved into separate structures. On paper, each move looked normal. Routine business, asset management, portfolio restructuring. But when financial professionals see a pattern of asset restructuring happening over a short period of time, they don't call it routine. They call it positioning. Inside certain financial circles, the pattern did not go unnoticed. And eventually, it didn't go unnoticed inside palace financial offices either, because the timing was interesting. Very interesting. While the palace was finalizing a $59 million calculation tied to Harry, Meghan was restructuring assets into what appeared to be more independent financial structures. Now, no official document says she was preparing to protect assets. No public statement says she was separating finances. But financial restructuring often speaks louder than public statements, because money moves usually happen before major life decisions, not after. And this created a very uncomfortable question inside Buckingham Palace. If a $59 million invoice landed on Harry's desk and Meghan's assets had already been repositioned, who would actually be responsible for paying? Because many of their deals were joint. Their brand was joint. Their media ventures were joint. But if the financial structures behind those ventures were quietly being separated, then the financial burden of any institutional debt might not be shared equally. In simple terms, palace advisors began to consider a possibility that changed the entire situation. Harry might be left holding the bill alone. And that possibility is what makes this story not just a financial dispute, but a strategic chess game being played across continents through accountants, lawyers, and financial advisors, while the public only sees headlines and interviews. Because by the time Prince Harry opened that envelope in California, the financial ground under his feet may have already shifted. The envelope sat on the desk longer than anyone expected, not because Prince Harry didn't understand what it was, but because he did. The Buckingham Palace crest on the top corner made that very clear. This was not a family letter. This was not a father writing to a son. This was an institution writing to a former member. And institutions don't write letters unless they are prepared for the consequences. When Harry finally opened it and saw the number, $59 million, the situation changed from emotional to mathematical. And mathematics is cold. Mathematics does not care about interviews, documentaries, public sympathy, or family history. Numbers either exist or they don't. Debts either stand or they don't. And according to the palace, this one stood very clearly on paper. The document was written in precise language. No anger, no blame, no personal words, just categories: property, security, administrative restructuring, legal consultations, infrastructure, transition costs. Each category explained calmly, professionally, almost as if the palace wanted the document to feel emotionless, because emotion could be argued with, but documentation could not. For Harry, this was the moment where the idea of stepping back from royal life stopped being a personal decision and started looking like a financial event with a price tag attached to it. Because independence sounds very different when it comes with an invoice. Inside California, far from palace walls and royal courtyards, this was no longer a royal drama, it was a financial crisis. Even for someone connected to royal wealth, $59 million is not a casual number. It's not a number you pay quickly. It's not a number you ignore. It's a number that changes plans, forces decisions, and creates pressure. And pressure changes people. The biggest question now wasn't whether the number was real. The palace had already decided decided it was. The real question was what Harry would do next, because every option in front of him came with consequences. If he paid, it would be seen as an admission that the palace was right, that the cost belonged to him, that the institution had the authority to calculate his exit, and that independence came with a bill. If he refused, the situation could turn legal, and a legal fight between Prince Harry and Buckingham Palace would not be a quiet family disagreement. It would become a global story, documents, testimonies, financial records, internal palace operations, all potentially dragged into public view. If he tried to negotiate, then the next chapter would happen behind closed doors, in meetings between lawyers, accountants, and advisors, where the real decisions about money and responsibility are always made. But there was another layer to this situation that made everything even more complicated, and that layer was Meghan's financial restructuring. Because by the time this invoice arrived, several of Meghan's business and financial positions had already been reorganized, assets repositioned, ownership structures adjusted, investments moved. On paper, everything looked like smart business, strategic, independent, flexible. But in situations like this, timing is everything. And the timing created a question that nobody wanted to ask out loud, but everyone inside financial and royal circles was quietly thinking. Was Meghan financially distancing herself before the bill arrived? No one publicly said that. No official document confirmed it. But financial strategy often reveals what public statements never will. People prepare financially for the future they think is coming, not the future they hope for. What makes this moment so historic is not just the money. The royal family has seen larger sums. The monarchy has survived wars, abdications, scandals, and financial crises before. But this situation is different because it represents something modern, a royal exit in the age of contracts, media companies, global branding, and personal commercial empires. This is not the 1800s where a prince disappears quietly into the countryside. This is the 21st century where a prince signs Netflix deals, book deals, media deals, speaking deals, and at the same time, an institution calculates the cost of his departure like a corporate separation. This is monarchy meeting modern business. And when those two worlds collide, everything becomes complicated. Now, the entire situation sits at a crossroads. If Harry pays, the story becomes the prince who paid for his freedom. If Harry fights, the story becomes the prince who went to war with the palace. If Harry negotiates, the story becomes the settlement that saved the monarchy from a public family financial war. But no matter which path he chooses, one thing is already certain. That envelope changed everything. Because once a number like 59 million is written on palace letterhead and sent across the ocean, the relationship between a prince and the palace is no longer just personal. It becomes contractual. It becomes institutional. It becomes history. And the most uncomfortable part of this entire story is not the money, not the invoice, not even the family tension. It's the question quietly sitting underneath all of it. The question nobody inside the palace wants to say out loud, but everyone is thinking. When Prince Harry left the royal family, he believed he was walking away from the system. But what if the system never actually let him go? And what if this invoice was the system reminding him?